Anatolia, at the end of the 13th century, was a land shaped by collapse. What had once been a relatively stable frontier of the Islamic world had become a fractured landscape of ruined cities, shifting loyalties, and competing powers. The foundations of order that had governed the region for generations were gone, replaced by uncertainty and constant struggle. This was not a sudden disaster, but the result of decades of political fragmentation, military defeat, and economic strain. For nearly 2 centuries, Anatolia had been dominated by the Seljuk Turks. After their victory over Byzantium at Manzikert in 1071, the Seljuks established a powerful state known as the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Centered in cities like Konya, the Sultanate controlled major trade routes linking the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, Iran, and Central Asia. Caravanserais dotted the roads, agriculture flourished in the plains, and Islamic institutions spread rapidly. Persian culture, Turkish military traditions, and Islamic law blended into a new Anatolian civilization. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, weaknesses grew. Succession disputes among Seljuk princes weakened central authority. Provincial governors and military commanders began acting independently, carving out personal domains. The sultans increasingly relied on slave soldiers and court factions, eroding loyalty within the state. By the early 13th century, the Seljuk administration struggled to control its own territory. The decisive blow came from the east. In the 1220s and 1230s, the Mongols swept across Central Asia and Iran with unprecedented speed and brutality. Entire cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and long-established powers erased. When the Mongol armies reached Anatolia, the Seljuks were unprepared for the scale of the threat. In 1243, Seljuk forces faced the Mongols at the Battle of Kayseri. The defeat was catastrophic. The Seljuk army collapsed, and the Sultanate was forced into vassalage under the Mongol Ilkhanate. From that moment, Seljuk sovereignty became largely symbolic. Sultans continued to rule in name, but real power lay with Mongol governors and tax collectors. Heavy tribute drained the economy. Mongol military demands disrupted agriculture and trade. Entire regions were depopulated as villagers fled insecurity or were forcibly relocated. The once organized state apparatus disintegrated. This collapse created a political vacuum across Anatolia. Central authority vanished, but no single power replaced it. Instead, the land fragmented into dozens of small principalities known as beyliks, ruled by Turkic warlords. These leaders were often former Seljuk commanders, tribal chiefs, or frontier warriors who claimed authority through military strength rather than legal legitimacy. Anatolia became a frontier society in the truest sense. Loyalty was personal, shifting, and transactional. Borders were fluid, defined by the reach of armed followers rather than treaties. Warfare was constant, but often small-scale raids, skirmishes, and seasonal campaigns rather than pitched battles. In this environment, survival depended on adaptability. The demographic makeup of Anatolia also changed dramatically during this period. Waves of Turkic nomads migrated westward, fleeing Mongol pressure in Central Asia. These groups brought herds, tents, and a warrior culture shaped by the steppe. They settled alongside existing populations of Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Persians, and Arabs. The result was a highly diverse society, bound together not by ethnicity, but by shared insecurity. Religious authority played a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion. Sufi orders spread rapidly, offering spiritual guidance and communal support in unstable times. Dervishes, mystics, and religious leaders traveled with nomadic groups, legitimizing rulers and inspiring fighters with promises of divine reward. Holy war against non-Muslim neighbors, especially the weakened Byzantine frontier, became both a spiritual and economic motivation. To the west, the Byzantine Empire was itself in decline. Once the dominant power of Anatolia, Byzantium had lost much of its territory following centuries of warfare. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 dealt a devastating blow as Crusader forces captured Constantinople and shattered imperial authority. Although the Byzantines eventually reclaimed the city, the empire never fully recovered. Its western Anatolian provinces were poorly defended, sparsely populated, and vulnerable to raids. This weakened frontier created opportunity. Turkic beyliks established themselves along the Byzantine border where raiding was profitable and resistance limited. These frontier warriors, known as Ghazis, saw themselves as champions of Islam advancing into Christian lands. Their identity was shaped not by fixed territory, but by constant movement and conflict. Economically, Anatolia suffered from severe instability. Long-distance trade declined as roads became unsafe. Urban centers shrank or were abandoned. Coinage became scarce, forcing many communities to rely on barter. Yet paradoxically, this hardship encouraged self-reliance and local innovation. Beylik rulers invested in fortifications, encouraged settlement, and offered land to attract followers. The Mongols, while destructive, also unintentionally shaped this environment. By maintaining loose oversight rather than direct administration, they allowed local leaders significant autonomy as long as taxes were paid. This policy enabled beyliks to grow stronger over time, accumulating wealth and military experience without interference. Political legitimacy during this era was deeply fragmented. No single ideology unified Anatolia. Seljuk sultans claimed authority through Islamic law and dynastic tradition. Mongol rulers asserted power through conquest and fear. Beylik leaders relied on charisma, military success, and religious patronage. Authority was negotiated constantly, often at the point of a sword. The absence of a strong central state also altered patterns of warfare. Instead of large armies, conflicts were fought by small, mobile units skilled in mounted combat. Speed and surprise mattered more than numbers. Leaders who could inspire loyalty and adapt tactics quickly survived. Those who relied on rigid hierarchy did not. Social mobility increased in this chaotic environment. Warriors could rise rapidly through bravery and success. Slaves could become commanders. Tribal affiliations mattered, but personal ability mattered more. This fluidity allowed new dynasties to emerge from obscurity. Anatolia thus became a testing ground. Countless beyliks appeared, flourished briefly, and vanished. Some were absorbed by neighbors, others collapsed due to internal conflict. Only a few developed the institutions necessary for long-term survival. Among these frontier principalities was a small, relatively insignificant beylik located in northwestern Anatolia near the Byzantine borderlands. At the time, it possessed no major cities, limited resources, and little recognition, yet it occupied a strategic position between larger powers and benefited from constant interaction with both Muslim and Christian worlds. The conditions that allowed this minor polity to survive were shaped entirely by the world that preceded it. The destruction of Seljuk authority removed barriers to ambition. Mongol domination prevented the rise of a single dominant rival. Byzantine weakness provided land, wealth, and prestige through conquest. Religious networks supplied legitimacy and manpower. A frontier culture rewarded courage, loyalty, and adaptability. This was not an age of stability, but an age of opportunity for those willing to seize it. Power belonged not to ancient dynasties or established capitals, but to those who could navigate chaos. Leadership was forged in conflict, and legitimacy earned through success. The world before the Ottomans was not waiting for them. It was hostile, fragmented, and unforgiving. Yet it was precisely this environment that made their rise possible. From the ruins of empires, from the movement of peoples, and from the vacuum left by collapse, a new force would emerge shaped by the very instability that defined the age. What followed was not inevitable. Many beyliks rose under similar conditions and failed. The difference lay in how one small frontier principality understood the world it inherited. But before that story begins, it is essential to understand the broken landscape from which it emerged, a land where empires had fallen, borders had dissolved, and history waited to be rewritten. Out of this fractured landscape emerged a leader whose name would become inseparable from one of the longest-lasting empires in world history. His beginnings were modest, his resources limited, and his domain barely visible on the political map of Anatolia. Yet within a single lifetime, the foundations of a new dynasty were laid. That man was Osman I. Osman was born around the middle of the 13th century, likely in the 1250s, into the Coyote tribe, one of the Oghuz Turkic clans that had migrated westward under pressure from Mongol expansion. His father, Ertuğrul, was the leader of this small tribal group. Like many Turkic nomads of the time, the Coyote lived a semi-nomadic life, moving with their herds and serving as frontier warriors in exchange for land and protection. Ertuğrul had settled his tribe in northwestern Anatolia, in a border region between the declining Byzantine territories and the fragmented Seljuk lands. This was not a prized location. It lacked major cities, fertile plains, and established trade routes, but it offered something else: proximity to opportunity. The Byzantine frontier was weak, poorly defended, and fragmented, providing constant chances for raids and expansion. When Ertuğrul died around 1280, leadership passed to Osman. At the time, Osman ruled little more than a cluster of villages and pastures. He was one of many beylik leaders, competing for followers, resources, and legitimacy. Nothing about his position guaranteed long-term success. What distinguished Osman was his ability to adapt to the frontier world he inhabited. He understood that authority could not rest on lineage alone. It had to be earned and constantly reinforced. Osman cultivated loyalty by distributing land, sharing plunder, and leading from the front in battle. His leadership was personal, direct, and pragmatic. Early Ottoman society under Osman was tribal in structure but flexible in practice. Warriors of different backgrounds joined his banner. Turkic nomads, former Seljuk soldiers, converts from Christianity, and adventurers drawn by the promise of reward. Allegiance was based less on ethnicity than on opportunity and success. Osman's military strategy reflected the realities of frontier warfare. Instead of seeking large, decisive battles, he focused on gradual expansion through raids, sieges of small forts, and the absorption of neighboring territories. These campaigns were seasonal and mobile, relying on speed, surprise, and local knowledge. Byzantine strongholds were his primary targets. The empire, weakened by internal conflict and lack of manpower, relied on isolated fortresses scattered across Bithynia. Osman exploited this vulnerability. He avoided heavily defended cities at first, concentrating instead on surrounding rural areas, cutting supply lines, and forcing gradual surrender. One of the most significant early victories was the capture of Karakahizar, a fortified settlement that allowed Osman to establish administrative control beyond a nomadic base. Here he appointed judges, organized taxation, and introduced Islamic institutions. This marked a transition from tribal leadership to territorial rule. Around this time, Osman began acting independently of Seljuk authority. While earlier beylik leaders nominally recognized Seljuk sultans or Mongol overlords, Osman's frontier position allowed him greater autonomy. As Seljuk power faded further, symbolic allegiance lost meaning. Authority now came from control on the ground. The year 1299 is traditionally cited as the foundation of the Ottoman state. This date does not mark a single dramatic declaration of independence, but rather a gradual shift. Osman ceased acknowledging Seljuk sovereignty, minted authority in his own name, and ruled as a fully autonomous leader. Later generations would look back on this moment as the birth of a new polity. Religion played a vital role in legitimizing Osman's leadership. Like other frontier rulers, he embraced the ideology of Gaza struggle in the path of Islam. This concept framed warfare against Byzantine lands as both a spiritual duty and a material opportunity. It attracted fighters motivated by faith, profit, or both. Osman also formed close ties with religious figures, particularly Sufi sheikhs and dervishes. These men provided spiritual guidance and social cohesion, especially among nomadic populations. Their support strengthened Osman's legitimacy and connected his rule to broader Islamic traditions. One of the most enduring legends associated with Osman is the Dream of Osman. According to later chronicles, Osman experienced a vision in which a tree grew from his chest, its branches spreading across the world, shading mountains and rivers. From this tree flowed power, justice, and prosperity. While the story was recorded generations after his death, it served an important purpose. It presented Ottoman rule as divinely ordained and destined for greatness. Whether or not Osman himself believed such a vision, he clearly understood the power of symbolism. His rule combined practical governance with powerful narratives that unified his followers and justified expansion. Osman's leadership style differed from many of his contemporaries. He was known for patience rather than recklessness, preferring consolidation over rapid overextension. He incorporated conquered populations instead of displacing them. Christians who accepted Ottoman authority were often allowed to retain land and religion in exchange for taxes and loyalty. This pragmatic approach reduced resistance and stabilized newly acquired territories. It also created a diverse population base that would later become a defining feature of the Ottoman state. Family and succession were central concerns. Osman prepared his son Orhan for leadership, involving him in military campaigns and governance. This ensured continuity and prevented the fragmentation that had destroyed earlier dynasties. The concept of dynastic rule, rather than tribal leadership, began to take shape. By the time of his death around 1323 or 1324, Osman controlled a territory far larger than the one he had inherited. His beylik had become the most dynamic power in northwestern Anatolia. More importantly, it possessed the institutional foundations of a state, a loyal military, administrative practices, religious legitimacy, and a clear line of succession. Osman never claimed the title of sultan. He ruled as a frontier lord, shaped by the realities of his environment. Yet the system he created was flexible enough to grow beyond him. His successors would inherit not just land, but a model of expansion, governance, and legitimacy. The world that produced Osman was one of chaos and opportunity. He did not restore the old order, nor did he simply exploit its ruins. He transformed frontier survival into a sustainable political structure. Where others saw instability, he saw potential. The dynasty that bore his name would expand across continents, rule for more than 6 centuries, and shape the history of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But at its origin stood a man who ruled a borderland, led by example, and understood the balance between force and accommodation. The Ottoman story did not begin with imperial ambition. It began with a leader navigating a broken world, turning uncertainty into strength, and a small frontier beylik into the seed of an empire that would redefine history. That seed now passed into new hands. With the death of Osman, leadership did not fracture, nor did the polity dissolve back into tribal obscurity. Instead, power transferred smoothly to his son Orhan, marking the first successful dynastic succession of the Ottomans. This transition alone set them apart from many rival beyliks, where succession often triggered civil war and collapse. Orhan inherited a frontier domain still shaped by tribal traditions, but he ruled in a world that demanded new forms of organization. Expansion had accelerated. Territory now included towns, agricultural lands, and sedentary populations that could not be governed through nomadic customs alone. The challenge was clear. The Ottomans had to evolve from a warband into a state. One of Orhan's earliest and most decisive actions was the capture of Bursa in 1326. Unlike earlier conquests of forts and villages, Bursa was a major urban center with economic, strategic, and symbolic value. Its fall marked a turning point. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital, transforming the beylik from a mobile frontier power into a territorially anchored polity. With Bursa came administration. Orhan established permanent institutions to manage taxation, justice, and land distribution. Judges trained in Islamic law were appointed to settle disputes and legitimize authority. Revenue systems were formalized, replacing ad hoc plunder with predictable taxation. This shift stabilized income and allowed long-term planning. Land became the foundation of Ottoman governance. Orhan expanded the practice of granting land revenues to warriors in exchange for military service. These grants did not convey ownership but the right to collect taxes from specific lands. This system tied military obligation directly to agricultural productivity and ensured loyalty to the ruler rather than to tribal chiefs. The army itself underwent critical transformation. Under Osman, military forces were loosely organized bands of mounted warriors. Under Orhan, this force began to professionalize. Infantry units were introduced to supplement cavalry, reflecting lessons learned from sieges and urban warfare. Discipline and hierarchy increased, reducing reliance on purely personal loyalty. One of the most significant innovations attributed to Orhan's reign was the early formation of a standing infantry force, a precursor to what would later become the Janissaries. These soldiers were salaried, directly loyal to the ruler, and trained for sustained campaigns. While still limited in number, their existence marked a fundamental shift away from purely tribal warfare. Administration extended beyond the army. Orhan minted coins in his own name, an assertion of sovereignty that placed the Ottomans alongside established states. He sponsored religious institutions, endowments, and public works, integrating the dynasty into the social and spiritual life of its subjects. Diplomacy also became a tool of expansion. Orhan forged alliances through marriage, including unions with Byzantine elites. These relationships were pragmatic, not ideological, allowing the Ottomans to exploit internal Byzantine divisions while avoiding unnecessary conflict. By the end of Orhan's reign, the Ottoman polity was no longer a frontier tribe. It possessed a capital, bureaucracy, standing forces, and a growing population of non-Turkic subjects. Its ruler governed not merely as a war leader, but as a sovereign. Succession again proved decisive. When Orhan died in 1362, power passed to his son Murad I. Murad inherited a more complex state than his grandfather could have imagined. His task was not just to preserve it, but to expand and institutionalize it on a far greater scale. Murad's reign marked the Ottomans' transition from a regional Anatolian power into a transcontinental empire. Almost immediately, expansion shifted decisively into Europe. The capture of Adrianople, renamed Edirne, provided a new capital strategically positioned between Anatolia and the Balkans. This move symbolized a profound transformation. The Ottoman state now straddled two continents. Governing such an entity required deeper administrative reform. Murad expanded the Timar system, ensuring that land grants were recorded, regulated, and reassigned by the central authority. This prevented hereditary local power bases from forming and kept military elites dependent on the Sultan. The army underwent further restructuring. Murad formalized the Janissary Corps, creating an elite infantry recruited through the Devshirme system. Christian youths were taken, converted to Islam, trained and bound exclusively to the Sultan. This system broke traditional tribal and familial ties, producing soldiers whose loyalty lay entirely with the state. Alongside the Janissaries, Murad developed the Sipahi cavalry as a structured force tied to land revenues. Infantry and cavalry now operated in coordination, giving the Ottomans tactical flexibility unmatched by their rivals. This military machine was not just powerful, it was sustainable. Murad also redefined sovereignty. He adopted the title of Sultan, signaling a claim to supreme political and military authority within the Islamic world. Governance became more centralized. Provincial governors were appointed directly by the ruler and rotated to prevent local entrenchment. Law and administration were systematized. Islamic courts coexisted with customary practices, creating a dual legal structure that allowed flexibility while maintaining legitimacy. Taxation became standardized, reducing arbitrary exactions and encouraging agricultural productivity. Social integration remained a hallmark of Ottoman rule. Conquered populations were not expelled en masse. Instead, local elites were co-opted, religious autonomy was often preserved, and communities were taxed according to established categories. This policy reduced rebellion and ensured steady revenue. Murad's expansion into the Balkans brought the Ottomans into prolonged conflict with European powers. Battles such as Maritsa demonstrated the effectiveness of the reformed army and shattered resistance in the region. Yet Murad did not rely solely on force. Vassalage agreements allowed local rulers to retain authority in exchange for tribute and military support. This combination of conquest and accommodation accelerated expansion while minimizing administrative strain. The Ottoman state grew not just in size, but in complexity. By the late 14th century, the Ottomans possessed characteristics absent from other beyliks. They had a centralized ruler, a professional army, codified land and tax systems, and a governing ideology that fused Islamic legitimacy with pragmatic rule. Power no longer depended on the personality of a single leader. It was embedded in institutions. Murad's death on the battlefield in 1389 symbolized the transformation he had overseen. The ruler of the Ottomans now stood at the center of a state powerful enough to challenge kings and empires. Succession again passed smoothly, reinforcing dynastic continuity. The transformation from tribe to state was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was the result of deliberate choices made by Orhan and Murad, choices that favored centralization over fragmentation, institutions over improvisation, and long-term governance over short-term gain. Where many frontier powers remained trapped by tribal structures, the Ottomans transcended them. They absorbed the lessons of collapse that had destroyed earlier states and built mechanisms designed to prevent the same fate. The foundations of empire were now firmly in place. What had begun as a small frontier beylik had become a disciplined, expanding state, poised to dominate regions far beyond its original borders. The engine of this transformation was not territory alone, but a system unlike anything its rivals possessed. At the heart of that system stood an institution that reshaped warfare, governance, and power itself: the Janissary Corps. Its creation marked a turning point not only for the Ottomans, but for the history of military organization across Eurasia. Before the rise of the Janissaries, most medieval armies were temporary forces. Kings and lords relied on feudal obligations, tribal loyalties, or mercenary contracts. Soldiers fought seasonally, often poorly trained and inconsistently paid. Loyalty lay with local leaders rather than the state. This model produced armies that were unpredictable, fragmented, and difficult to control. The Ottomans chose a different path. During the reign of Murad I, the need for a permanent, centrally controlled army became clear. Expansion into the Balkans required long campaigns, sieges, and disciplined formations capable of operating far from home. Tribal cavalry alone was no longer sufficient. The solution was radical. Instead of relying solely on free warriors bound by kinship or land, the Ottoman state created a standing infantry force whose loyalty belonged exclusively to the ruler. These soldiers would not be tied to tribe, family, or province. They would be servants of the state. Thus emerged the Janissaries. The Janissary Corps was formed in the mid-14th century as an elite infantry unit paid directly from the central treasury. Unlike earlier forces, they were salaried professionals. Their service was continuous, not seasonal. Training was systematic, discipline strict, and hierarchy clearly defined. What truly distinguished the Janissaries, however, was how they were recruited. The devshirme system was one of the most controversial and innovative practices of the Ottoman state. At regular intervals, officials collected Christian boys from villages in the Balkans and Anatolia. These children were removed from their families, converted to Islam, and educated under state supervision. This was not random enslavement. Selection was deliberate. Boys were chosen for intelligence, physical ability, and potential. They were trained not only in warfare, but in language, administration, and religion. The most talented were sent to palace schools where they could rise to become commanders, governors, or even grand viziers. Others entered the Janissary Corps as soldiers. The logic behind the devshirme system was strategic. By severing recruits from their original social ties, the state created individuals whose identity and loyalty were shaped entirely by Ottoman institutions. Their advancement depended on merit and obedience, not birth or tribal affiliation. This produced a new ruling elite, one that was loyal, disciplined, and deeply invested in the survival of the state. For the Janissaries themselves, life was highly regulated. They lived in barracks, followed strict codes of conduct, and trained continuously. Marriage was initially forbidden, reinforcing their separation from civilian society. Their pay was regular, their status privileged, and their identity collective. In battle, the Janissaries transformed Ottoman warfare. They fought as organized infantry, at a time when many European armies still relied heavily on feudal cavalry. Their discipline allowed them to hold formations under pressure, defend siege lines, and exploit breakthroughs with precision. They were also early adopters of new military technology. As firearms began to appear in the late medieval period, the Janissaries integrated them faster and more effectively than most rivals. Muskets, artillery support, and coordinated infantry tactics gave the Ottomans a decisive advantage. The Janissaries did not operate alone. They were part of a broader military system designed for efficiency and sustainability. Cavalry units, known as sipahis, were tied to land grants through the Timar system. These mounted soldiers provided mobility, reconnaissance, and shock power, while the Janissaries held ground and broke enemy formations. This combined arms approach allowed the Ottomans to adapt to different terrains and opponents. In open fields, cavalry dominated. In sieges and fortified zones, infantry and artillery took precedence. Command structure ensured coordination rather than competition between units. Centralization was the key. Unlike feudal armies, Ottoman forces answered to a single authority. Command flowed downward from the Sultan through appointed officers. Promotions were based on service and competence rather than noble birth. The military system was inseparable from governance. The same principles that shaped the Janissaries shaped the state itself. Loyalty to the center, merit-based advancement, and institutional discipline defined Ottoman administration. The Devshirme system fed not only the army, but the bureaucracy. Many of the empire's most powerful officials rose from Devshirme backgrounds. This created a governing class that owed everything to the state and had no independent power base. This structure solved a problem that had plagued earlier empires. Local elites often resisted central authority, undermining unity. The Ottomans neutralized this threat by creating elites who were powerful but dependent. Religion played a complex role in this system. While the Devshirme involved forced conversion, it was justified within the framework of Islamic governance as a form of state service. Over time, many Devshirme families viewed selection as an opportunity rather than a loss, given the potential for wealth and influence. The Janissaries themselves developed a strong corporate identity. Rituals, symbols, and shared traditions reinforced cohesion. They were not just soldiers, they were a class within Ottoman society. Their effectiveness reshaped regional politics. Balkan rulers faced an enemy that did not disband after campaigns, did not fracture over succession disputes, and did not rely on feudal obligations. Resistance became increasingly difficult. The psychological impact was as significant as the military one. The reputation of the Janissaries spread rapidly. Their discipline, resilience, and battlefield coordination inspired fear and respect. Ottoman victories reinforced the perception of inevitability. This system also allowed rapid mobilization. Because the army was maintained year-round, the Ottomans could respond quickly to threats or opportunities. Campaign seasons lengthened. Strategic initiative remained firmly in Ottoman hands. Financially, sustaining such a force required efficient taxation and administration. The state refined its revenue systems to support salaries, equipment, and logistics. In return, military success expanded taxable land, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. By the 15th century, the Ottoman military machine had few equals. European states would not develop comparable standing armies for generations. When they did, they often borrowed directly or indirectly from the Ottoman model. The Janissaries were not merely a unit within the army, they were a symbol of a new kind of power, centralized, professional, and institutional. Their existence marked the Ottomans as something fundamentally different from other medieval polities. Yet this system was not without tension. Concentrated power always carried risk. A force so influential could shape politics as much as warfare. For now, however, discipline held, and loyalty to the Sultan remained strong. The combination of the Devshirme system, a standing infantry, coordinated cavalry, and centralized command made the Ottomans exceptionally resilient. They could absorb losses, adapt tactics, and replace leadership without collapsing. Empires before them had relied on tradition, lineage, or divine mandate. The Ottomans relied on systems. This was the secret of their early dominance. Not sheer numbers, not momentary brilliance, but structures designed to endure. The Janissaries embodied that philosophy, soldiers forged by the state for the state. As the empire continued to expand, this system would carry Ottoman banners across continents. It would break armies, topple kingdoms, and reshape the balance of power. For the moment, it stood as the clearest expression of Ottoman innovation, a force that turned a frontier state into an unstoppable empire. That force now moved decisively beyond Anatolia. What had begun as opportunistic raids across a weakened frontier evolved into a sustained, strategic expansion into southeastern Europe. The Ottoman entry into the Balkans was not a single invasion, but a gradual process shaped by military discipline, political calculation, and the fractured condition of their opponents. The gateway was geography. The narrow straits separating Anatolia from Europe had long been crossed by armies and traders, but the Ottomans were the first Anatolian power to establish a permanent foothold west of the Bosporus. In the mid-14th century, a combination of Byzantine civil war and Ottoman opportunism opened the door. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of territorial loss, was divided by internal conflict. Rival claimants to the throne sought foreign allies, and Ottoman forces were repeatedly invited across the straits as mercenaries. Each intervention brought knowledge of terrain, fortifications, and political rivalries. What began as assistance soon became occupation. The capture of Gallipoli in 1354 marked a decisive moment. An earthquake had damaged the city's defenses, and Ottoman troops moved in swiftly, fortifying it as their first permanent base in Europe. This was not a temporary raid. It was a strategic anchor, allowing continuous movement of troops between Anatolia and the Balkans. From Gallipoli, expansion accelerated under Murad I. Rather than advancing recklessly, Murad pursued a methodical strategy. Key routes, river valleys, and fortified towns were targeted to secure supply lines and isolate resistance. Local rulers were offered vassalage before destruction. Many accepted. The Balkans at this time were politically fragmented. The Serbian Empire had collapsed after the death of Stefan Dušan. Bulgaria was divided into rival tsardoms. Greek, Albanian, and Bosnian lords ruled small territories with limited coordination. There was no unified front capable of sustained resistance. Ottoman armies exploited this fragmentation. At the Battle of Maritsa in 1371, a coalition of Serbian nobles attempted to halt Ottoman advance. The result was devastating. Ottoman forces launched a surprise night attack, routing the larger Christian army and killing its leaders. The defeat shattered organized resistance in much of the Central Balkans. Following Maritsa, large areas of Macedonia and Thrace fell under Ottoman control. Adrianople, renamed Edirne, became the new capital. Its location symbolized a profound shift. The center of Ottoman power now lay in Europe, not Asia. Edirne was more than a military base. It became an administrative hub, a royal residence, and a symbol of imperial ambition. From here, the Ottomans governed territories on both sides of the straits, effectively becoming a transcontinental state. The expansion continued through a combination of conquest and vassalage. Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine rulers were often allowed to retain their thrones in exchange for tribute and military support. This reduced the need for direct administration while extending Ottoman influence deep into Europe. Military innovation played a central role. Ottoman forces combined disciplined infantry, mobile cavalry, and effective siege techniques. Fortresses that had resisted feudal armies for decades fell one by one. The psychological impact of repeated defeat weakened morale among defenders. Religion, while significant, was not the sole driver. Ottoman policy toward conquered Christian populations was pragmatic. Churches often remained open, local laws were partially preserved, and communities were taxed according to established systems. This reduced incentives for rebellion and allowed relatively smooth integration. Resistance, however, did not disappear. In 1389, a major coalition led by Serbian forces confronted the Ottomans at the Battle of Kosovo. The battle was brutal and indecisive in immediate tactical terms. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and Murad I was killed on the battlefield. Yet strategically, Kosovo favored the Ottomans. Serbian leadership was decimated, while Ottoman succession proceeded without collapse. Murad's son Bayezid I assumed power swiftly, preventing fragmentation. The Serbian lands soon became vassals, cementing Ottoman dominance in the region. Bayezid earned the laqab Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed and intensity of his campaigns. He accelerated expansion in both Europe and Anatolia, pressing hard against remaining Balkan resistance and tightening control over Byzantine territories. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottomans controlled most of Bulgaria, large parts of Greece, Macedonia, and Serbia. The Byzantine Empire was reduced to a handful of cities, including Constantinople itself, now encircled by Ottoman lands. European powers responded with alarm. Crusading armies were assembled to halt Ottoman advance. In 1396, a large coalition of French, Hungarian, German, and other forces marched east, confident in their numerical superiority and knightly tradition. The encounter at Nicopolis proved disastrous for the Crusaders. Ottoman forces exploited their lack of coordination and overconfidence. Heavy cavalry charges were absorbed by disciplined infantry and countered by mobile forces. The Crusader army was annihilated. Nicopolis sent shockwaves across Europe. It demonstrated that Ottoman forces could defeat the best armies the West could assemble. The myth of invincibility surrounding European knights was shattered. The Ottomans were no longer a regional threat. They were a continental power. Expansion into Europe also transformed the Ottoman state internally. Governing Christian-majority territories required administrative flexibility. Systems of taxation, land tenure, and law were adapted to local conditions. The empire became increasingly multi-ethnic and multi-religious. This diversity did not weaken the state. On the contrary, it expanded its resource base. Balkan lands were agriculturally productive and strategically vital. New recruits entered the army and bureaucracy. Revenue funded further military development. Trade routes linking Europe and Asia passed through Ottoman territory, increasing economic importance. Cities flourished under relative stability. The empire positioned itself as a bridge between worlds. At the same time, expansion into Europe altered Ottoman identity. The state was no longer defined solely by frontier warfare against Byzantium. It now confronted Latin Christendom, rival kingdoms, and emerging European powers. Diplomacy became more complex. Warfare became larger in scale. The Ottomans adapted quickly. Intelligence networks monitored rival courts. Alliances were manipulated. Rivals were played against one another. The empire rarely fought all its enemies at once. This strategic sophistication set the Ottomans apart. Expansion was not reckless conquest, but calculated growth. By the turn of the 15th century, the Ottoman state stretched across Anatolia and deep into southeastern Europe. It controlled strategic waterways, fertile plains, and key cities. Its army was feared. Its administration was stable. Its dynasty was secure. The rise of a transcontinental empire was no accident. It was the product of military innovation, political pragmatism, and the ability to exploit a fragmented world. Europe had become a central theater of Ottoman history. The balance of power had shifted permanently. What followed would not be a question of survival, but of supremacy. The empire had crossed a threshold. It was no longer expanding at the edges of history. It was now shaping it. At the center of that history stood a city that had defied conquerors for more than 1,000 years. Constantinople was not merely a capital. It was an idea. Founded as the eastern heart of the Roman world, protected by massive walls and strategic seas, it symbolized imperial continuity, Christian authority, and political legitimacy. For centuries, its survival had shaped the balance of power between East and West. By the mid-15th century, however, that survival had become fragile. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its territory had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, a few nearby towns, and scattered holdings in Greece. Population decline, economic weakness, and internal divisions had hollowed it out. The once great empire depended increasingly on diplomacy, foreign aid, and the hope that its walls would continue to protect it. Surrounding the city on all sides was a far different power. The Ottoman state had recovered from earlier setbacks and emerged stronger, more centralized, and more ambitious. At its head stood a ruler determined to achieve what generations before him had failed to do. That ruler was Mehmed II, who ascended the throne in 1451 at just 19 years old. Despite his youth, Mehmed possessed a clear vision and an uncompromising sense of purpose. He was educated, multilingual, and deeply aware of history. To him, Constantinople was not just a strategic prize, it was the key to imperial legitimacy. Control of the city would unite Ottoman territories in Anatolia and Europe, eliminate a persistent rival, and transform the Ottomans from a powerful state into a true empire. Mehmed understood that as long as Constantinople remained independent, Ottoman dominance would always be incomplete. Preparation for the conquest began immediately. Mehmed moved decisively to isolate the city diplomatically and militarily. Treaties were signed with European powers to prevent outside intervention. Potential rivals within the empire were neutralized. Resources were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. One of Mehmed's most significant innovations was his embrace of new military technology. Siege warfare had evolved, and the Ottomans intended to exploit that evolution fully. Mehmed commissioned massive cannons capable of breaching walls once thought impregnable. These weapons, cast by skilled engineers, dwarfed anything previously used in warfare. The most famous of these cannons could fire stone projectiles weighing hundreds of kilograms. Transporting them required immense effort, roads reinforced, bridges rebuilt, and teams of men and animals coordinated across vast distances. Their very existence signaled that the old rules of defense were changing. At the same time, Mehmed strengthened Ottoman naval power. While the Byzantines still controlled the Golden Horn with a massive chain, Ottoman ships were prepared to challenge that defense. The city would be attacked by land and sea simultaneously. Constantinople's defenses were formidable but strained. The Theodosian walls, multiple layers of stone, towers, and moats, had withstood countless sieges. Yet they required manpower to defend, and the Byzantine population was too small to fully man them. The defending force numbered only a few thousand, bolstered by foreign volunteers, most notably Genoese soldiers. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, faced an impossible situation. Appeals to Western Europe brought promises but little concrete aid. Religious divisions between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism complicated any unified response. The city stood largely alone. In April 1453, Ottoman forces surrounded Constantinople. The siege began with artillery bombardment unlike anything the world had seen. Day after day, cannons pounded the walls, cracking stone that had stood for centuries. Defenders worked tirelessly to repair breaches under constant fire. The Ottomans combined bombardment with psychological pressure. Drums, horns, and war cries echoed through the night. Negotiations were offered and rejected. Mehmed made clear that surrender would spare the city from destruction, but resistance would bring consequences. One of the most dramatic moments of the siege came when Ottoman ships were transported over land into the Golden Horn, bypassing the defensive chain. This maneuver stunned the defenders and exposed the city to attack from an unexpected direction. It demonstrated not only ingenuity, but a willingness to attempt the unthinkable. Despite overwhelming odds, the defenders held on for weeks. Fighting was relentless. Assaults were launched, repelled, and launched again. Casualties mounted on both sides. Yet the balance of power steadily shifted. On the 29th of May, 1453, after nearly 2 months of siege, the final assault began. Waves of Ottoman troops attacked the weakened sections of the walls. Elite units followed, exploiting breaches created by artillery. In the chaos of close combat, defense collapsed. Emperor Constantine VII was last seen fighting alongside his soldiers. His death marked the end of an empire that traced its origins back to Rome itself. Constantinople fell, The capture of the city sent shockwaves across the world. For Christian Europe, it was a catastrophe. The loss of Constantinople shattered a final barrier between the Ottomans and the heart of Europe. Scholars, merchants, and refugees fled west, carrying texts and knowledge that would influence the Renaissance. For the Ottomans, it was a triumph of historic proportions. Mehmed entered the city as a conqueror, but not as a destroyer. He moved quickly to restore order, halt uncontrolled looting, and re-establish administration. The city was to be preserved, not ruined. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, though older names continued in use for generations. More importantly, it was transformed into an imperial capital. Mehmed set about repopulating the city, encouraging Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle there. Religious communities were granted autonomy under their leaders, ensuring stability and continuity. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque. This act symbolized the transfer of imperial authority, but the structure itself was preserved and respected. Mehmed understood the power of symbols and sought to link Ottoman rule with the legacy of empire. Administratively, Istanbul became the heart of a centralized state. New palaces, mosques, markets, and institutions were constructed. Roads and aqueducts were repaired. The city was reshaped to serve as the seat of a growing empire. Mehmed adopted the title of Caesar of Rome, asserting continuity with the imperial tradition of Constantinople. This was not empty rhetoric. Ottoman law, administration, and ceremony increasingly reflected imperial ambition rather than frontier pragmatism. Militarily, the fall of Constantinople confirmed the effectiveness of Ottoman innovations. Cannon warfare had permanently altered the balance between offense and defense. Fortifications across Europe would have to adapt or fall. The age of medieval walls was ending. Politically, the conquest eliminated the Byzantine Empire entirely. A state that had survived invasions, plagues, and internal collapse for over a millennium ceased to exist. In its place rose an empire that combined Islamic governance with Roman imperial legacy. The capture of Istanbul also secured Ottoman dominance over key trade routes. Control of the Bosporus allowed regulation of commerce between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Economic power followed military victory. Mehmed II did not stop with Constantinople. He used the city as a base for further expansion into the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Aegean. But the conquest of 1453 remained unique. It was both an end and a beginning. For the Ottomans, it marked their arrival as a world empire. For Europe, it was a moment of reckoning. For history, it was a turning point that reshaped global power structures. The city that had once stood as a bulwark against conquest now became the symbol of Ottoman supremacy. Istanbul was no longer a prize to be taken. It was the heart of an empire that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. The fall of Constantinople was not simply the capture of a city. It was the moment when medieval worlds gave way to early modern empires, and the Ottomans stood at the center of that transformation. The power of the Ottoman state did not rest solely on armies or laws. It rested on people, millions of them spread across continents, speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, and living under a single imperial authority. The challenge the Ottomans faced was not only how to conquer, but how to rule without tearing the empire apart. Unlike many empires that sought uniformity, the Ottomans built durability through managed diversity. From the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Arab lands to North Africa, the empire governed Muslims, Christians, and Jews within a flexible system that prioritized order, taxation, and loyalty over forced assimilation. At the center of this arrangement stood the Ottoman conception of sovereignty. The Sultan ruled as the supreme political authority, but not as an enforcer of religious uniformity. Islamic law shaped the state, yet it coexisted with customary practices and communal autonomy. This balance allowed a vast and heterogeneous population to function under a single imperial framework. Muslims formed the ruling religious community and occupied most military and administrative positions. Islamic institutions, mosques, courts, schools, and charitable foundations structured public life. Yet Muslims were never the sole inhabitants of the empire, nor were they the majority in many regions, especially in the Balkans. Christians constituted a significant portion of the population, including Orthodox Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and others. Jews, many of whom arrived after expulsions from Western Europe in the late 15th century, formed vibrant communities in cities such as Istanbul, Salonika, and Edirne. Rather than dissolving these communities, the Ottomans organized them. The millet system was the institutional expression of this approach. While the term itself gained prominence later, the underlying practice existed earlier. Religious communities were recognized as corporate bodies with internal autonomy. Each millet governed its own religious affairs, personal law, education, and charitable institutions. Orthodox Christians were led by the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul, who served not only as a religious figure but as an intermediary between his community and the state. Armenian Christians had their own patriarch. Jewish communities were headed by chief rabbis. These leaders were responsible for maintaining order within their communities and ensuring the collection of taxes owed to the state. This arrangement served imperial interests. By delegating authority downward, the state reduced administrative burden and minimized resistance. Communities governed themselves in daily matters while remaining firmly integrated into the imperial system. Legal pluralism was a defining feature of Ottoman rule. Muslims were subject to Islamic courts, which handled criminal cases, contracts, inheritance, and family law. Non-Muslims were allowed to use their own religious courts for personal matters, though they could also appeal to Islamic courts if they chose. This flexibility often worked to their advantage. In commercial life, interactions between communities were common. Muslims, Christians, and Jews traded, partnered, and litigated together. Markets were shared spaces governed by state regulation rather than religious segregation. Economic pragmatism often outweighed doctrinal division. Taxation reflected religious distinction but not exclusion. Non-Muslims paid a poll tax in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. In return, they retained their faith, property, and communal institutions. For the state, this system provided predictable revenue. For subjects, it offered stability. Daily life in the empire was shaped less by imperial ideology than by local custom. In villages, agricultural rhythms dictated existence. In cities, neighborhoods were often organized by religion or occupation, but interaction was constant. Coffee houses, markets, baths, and workshops brought people together across communal lines. Urban centers such as Istanbul were profoundly cosmopolitan. Languages overlapped. Attire varied by profession and status rather than ethnicity alone. Food, music, and craftsmanship reflected blended traditions developed over generations. Slavery existed within the empire, but its forms differed from later racialized systems. Slaves could rise to positions of influence, particularly within the palace and administration. Many officials of the state were of non-Muslim origin, integrated through institutional systems rather than excluded by birth. Conversion to Islam occurred, but it was not universally forced. Some converted for social mobility, others through personal conviction. Many did not convert at all and lived full lives within their own traditions. The state's primary concern was loyalty and order, not religious conformity. This tolerance was not rooted in modern concepts of equality. Hierarchies existed. Muslims held privileged status. Non-Muslims faced legal and social limitations. Yet compared to contemporary European states marked by expulsions, forced conversions, and sectarian violence, the Ottoman model was remarkably inclusive. The empire's treatment of Jews illustrates this contrast clearly. When Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, the Ottomans welcomed many of them. They brought skills in trade, medicine, printing, and finance. Jewish communities flourished, contributing significantly to urban economies and cultural life. Education followed similar plural patterns. Religious schools taught doctrine and literacy within each community. Islamic madrasas trained scholars and administrators. Knowledge circulated across boundaries, particularly in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Women's lives varied widely depending on class, location, and religion. While legal restrictions existed, women could own property, engage in commerce, and appear in court. Records show women actively managing estates, endowments, and businesses, particularly in urban areas. The state relied heavily on documentation. Registers recorded land, taxes, population, and obligations. This bureaucratic culture allowed the empire to manage diversity systematically rather than through coercion alone. Conflict did occur. Rebellions, sectarian tensions, and local disputes were part of imperial life. The Ottoman response was typically pragmatic. Force was used when necessary, but accommodation followed. Stability mattered more than uniformity. Over time, this system produced a shared imperial identity layered over communal differences. Subjects might identify as Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish, or Muslim, but they also identified as living under Ottoman rule. The empire became a framework within which multiple identities could coexist. This coexistence strengthened the state. Diverse populations supplied manpower, taxes, skills, and connections. The empire's reach across trade routes and cultures enhanced its resilience and adaptability. Yet diversity also required constant management. Balance depended on effective leadership, fair administration, and economic stability. When these weakened, tensions surfaced more easily. At its height, however, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated that long-term rule over many peoples was possible without enforced sameness. Its system was neither egalitarian nor modern, but it was functional, flexible, and durable. This empire of many peoples was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate policies shaped by experience, necessity, and pragmatism. The Ottomans understood that power could be multiplied by inclusion and lost through exclusion. As the centuries passed, this balance would face growing pressure from internal change, economic shifts, and external competition. But during the height of imperial strength, the Ottoman approach to diversity stood as one of the most sophisticated systems of governance the early modern world had produced. The question that remained was whether this delicate equilibrium could endure in a changing world, one increasingly defined by new ideas of power, identity, and sovereignty. The answer would be shaped on battlefields stretching from the heart of Central Europe to the mountains of Iran and the waters of the Mediterranean. For more than 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was locked in near-constant conflict with 2 formidable rivals, Christian Europe in the west and Shia Persia in the east. These wars tested the limits of Ottoman power and revealed both the strengths and constraints of imperial expansion. In Europe, the Ottomans faced the growing might of the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs ruled a sprawling collection of territories that included Austria, Spain, and much of Central Europe. Their ambitions directly collided with Ottoman dominance in the Balkans and Hungary. This rivalry was not a single war, but a long series of conflicts marked by shifting fronts, uneasy truces, and repeated campaigns. Hungary became the primary battleground. After the Ottoman victory at Mohacs in 1526, the medieval Hungarian kingdom collapsed. The land was divided, Central Hungary fell under direct Ottoman administration, western regions came under Habsburg control, and Transylvania existed as an autonomous principality under Ottoman suzerainty. This tripartite division turned Hungary into a permanent frontier zone. Wars with the Habsburgs were unlike earlier Ottoman conquests. Fortified cities, organized standing armies, and improved artillery on both sides made rapid expansion difficult. Campaigns were long and costly. Sieges replaced sweeping cavalry victories. Control shifted slowly, often measured in towns rather than provinces. Vienna symbolized the limits of Western expansion. After the failed siege of 1529 under Suleiman I and a second unsuccessful attempt in 1683, it became clear that Central Europe lay beyond the sustainable reach of Ottoman power. Distance, logistics, weather, and increasingly capable European defenses imposed hard constraints. Despite this, the Ottomans remained a dominant force in southeastern Europe for generations. Their armies held Belgrade, Buda, and vast territories along the Danube. Yet the balance of power was no longer decisively in their favor. European states began to reform their militaries, adopting standing armies, firearms, and centralized command structures similar to those pioneered earlier by the Ottomans. While the western frontier was defined by stalemate, the eastern frontier was defined by ideological rivalry. To the east stood Safavid Persia, a powerful state that embraced Shia Islam as its official doctrine. This religious difference transformed political rivalry into sectarian conflict. For the Ottomans, who positioned themselves as defenders of Sunni Islam, the Safavids represented both a political and ideological threat. The conflict was not merely about territory, but about religious authority and legitimacy in the Islamic world. Battles between the two empires were fierce and recurrent. One of the most decisive early encounters was the Battle of Calderan in 1514, where Ottoman forces used artillery and firearms to defeat the Safavid army, which relied heavily on cavalry. The victory secured eastern Anatolia and demonstrated the military superiority of gunpowder warfare. Yet Calderan did not end the rivalry. The mountainous terrain of eastern Anatolia and Iran favored defense and made decisive conquest difficult. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Campaigns were costly and exhausting. Supply lines stretched across harsh landscapes. Ottoman control over regions such as Iraq, including Baghdad, was strategically vital. These lands provided access to trade routes, agricultural resources, and symbolic prestige. Baghdad, once the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, held immense cultural and religious significance. However, holding these territories required constant vigilance. Safavid counterattacks, local rebellions, and tribal politics complicated administration. Peace treaties were often temporary, establishing borders that would later be contested again. Unlike European wars, which increasingly followed diplomatic conventions, Ottoman Safavid conflicts were deeply shaped by sectarian rhetoric. Propaganda, religious edicts, and persecution of suspected sympathizers intensified internal tensions within both empires. These Eastern wars forced the Ottomans to fight on two major fronts simultaneously. Resources had to be divided, armies were stretched, strategic priorities conflicted. Decisions made in Europe affected outcomes in Persia, and vice versa. Naval warfare added another dimension to these struggles. Control of the Mediterranean was essential for protecting trade, projecting power, and countering European rivals. Under Suleiman and his successors, the Ottoman navy became a formidable force. Ottoman fleets clashed with Venice, Spain, and other maritime powers across the Mediterranean. Victories such as the Battle of Preveza in 1538 established Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Trade routes were secured, and North African territories were integrated into the empire. Yet naval power also faced limits. In 1571, a coalition of European states defeated the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto. Although the Ottomans rebuilt their navy quickly and retained strategic control of much of the Mediterranean, Lepanto revealed that Ottoman dominance at sea was not absolute. These conflicts marked a turning point. The empire remained powerful, but it no longer expanded effortlessly. Each new conquest required greater investment. Each war strained finances and manpower. Technological parity began to emerge. European armies adopted firearms, drill, and fortifications that reduced Ottoman advantages. Safavid Persia modernized its forces over time. The gap that had once favored the Ottomans narrowed. Internal challenges compounded external pressure. Prolonged warfare, increased taxation, provoking unrest in Anatolia and the Balkans. Supply systems were strained. Administrative corruption grew as officials sought to profit from extended campaigns. The empire's leadership adapted, but slowly. Institutions designed for expansion now had to manage defense, diplomacy, and balance. War was no longer a means of constant growth, but a struggle to maintain existing borders. By the 17th century, the Ottomans were still one of the world's great powers, but the momentum of earlier centuries had slowed. Expansion reached its natural limits. Geography, logistics, and the rise of equally organized rivals imposed constraints that no amount of valor could overcome. These wars reshaped the empire's role in global politics. The Ottomans became a stabilizing force in southeastern Europe and the Middle East, rather than an ever-expanding conqueror. Diplomacy gained importance alongside military action. Treaties replaced total victory as the primary outcome of war. Borders became more fixed. The empire's survival depended increasingly on management rather than conquest. Yet these conflicts also demonstrated resilience. Despite fighting powerful enemies on multiple fronts for generations, the Ottoman state did not collapse. Its institutions endured, its armies adapted, its diplomatic networks expanded. The wars with Europe and Persia defined the mature empire. They revealed both the reach of Ottoman power and its boundaries. They marked the transition from a dynamic, expansionist state to a complex imperial system operating in a competitive world. The age of unstoppable conquest was over. What remained was the challenge of sustaining empire in an era where power was no longer absolute and survival depended on adaptation. For the Ottoman Empire, this challenge unfolded slowly and unevenly. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic fall from greatness. Instead, decline revealed itself through a series of pressures: economic strain, administrative corruption, military stagnation, and internal power struggles that gradually eroded the foundations of imperial strength built over centuries. One of the earliest and most persistent signs was economic stress. The Ottoman economy had long depended on agricultural revenues, land-based taxation, and control of trade routes linking Europe and Asia. By the late 16th century, this system began to falter. Global economic shifts, particularly the influx of silver from the Americas into Europe, disrupted established monetary systems. Inflation spread across the Mediterranean world, and the Ottoman currency steadily lost value. Prices rose faster than wages. Soldiers, officials, and urban workers found their incomes insufficient. Fixed salaries, once a stabilizing feature of the state, became a source of dissatisfaction. Taxpayers struggled to meet obligations, while provincial officials increasingly resorted to extortion to compensate for declining real income. At the same time, traditional land systems weakened. The Timar system, which had tied military service to land revenue, began to break down. As wars became longer and more expensive, the state needed immediate cash rather than long-term service obligations. Land revenues were increasingly converted into tax farms, sold to the highest bidder for short-term gain. This shift had serious consequences. Tax farmers prioritized profit over sustainability, squeezing peasants and undermining agricultural productivity. Rural populations fled villages, joined bandit groups, or migrated to cities in search of survival. The countryside, once the backbone of imperial revenue, became unstable. Corruption flourished in this environment. Offices that had once been granted on merit were increasingly bought and sold. Bribes became a routine part of administration. Positions were treated as investments rather than responsibilities. Officials sought to recover their costs quickly, often at the expense of the population. The central government struggled to control this process. Oversight mechanisms existed, but enforcement weakened as patronage networks expanded. Loyalty shifted from institutions to individuals, eroding the principle of centralized authority that had once defined Ottoman governance. Military stagnation compounded these problems. The army that had once given the Ottomans a decisive edge now faced rivals who had adopted similar technologies and tactics. European states developed standing armies, improved drill, and refined artillery. The Ottoman advantage in gunpowder warfare disappeared. The Janissary Corps, once the symbol of discipline and innovation, became a source of instability. Over time, recruitment rules were relaxed. Hereditary membership replaced merit-based selection. Janissaries engaged in trade, married, and established local interests, weakening their exclusive loyalty to the state. As their political influence grew, discipline declined. Janissaries resisted reform, opposed new military units, and intervened in palace politics. Mutinies became frequent. Sultans were deposed or intimidated by forces that were supposed to serve them. Attempts at military reform often failed due to internal resistance. New training methods and technologies threatened established privileges. Reform-minded rulers faced opposition not only from conservative soldiers, but from religious authorities and bureaucrats who feared loss of status. Palace politics further destabilized the empire. Succession practices changed, reducing the number of experienced princes governing provinces before ascending the throne. Sultans increasingly came to power with limited administrative or military experience. Power shifted to the imperial court, where factions competed for influence. The harem, senior officials, military leaders, and religious authorities all vied for control. Decisions were shaped by intrigue as much as by strategy. This environment produced short reigns and inconsistent policies. Long-term planning suffered. Each change of ruler brought uncertainty, purges, and reversals. Stability, once a hallmark of the empire, became fragile. Provincial control weakened as well. Distant regions became harder to govern effectively. Local elites accumulated power, sometimes ruling in all but name. Rebellions flared, especially in Anatolia, where displaced peasants and unemployed soldiers formed armed bands. These internal revolts were not attempts to overthrow the empire, but signs of systemic stress. Suppressing them required military force, draining resources and further destabilizing rural life. Externally, the empire faced increasingly confident rivals. European states not only resisted Ottoman expansion, but began pushing back. Wars became defensive rather than offensive. Territories gained over centuries were now contested. Diplomacy grew more complex as the balance of power shifted. The Ottomans were no longer the unquestioned arbiters of regional politics. Alliances shifted. Treaties imposed constraints that would have been unthinkable during the empire's height. Culturally and intellectually, the empire did not collapse, but it struggled to adapt to rapid change. Scientific and technological developments in Europe accelerated, while Ottoman institutions remained cautious. Printing, for example, spread slowly due to resistance from scribes and conservative circles. Education continued, but innovation lagged behind competitors. The empire relied increasingly on inherited systems rather than experimentation. What had once been strengths, tradition, and continuity became obstacles to adaptation. Yet it is important to understand decline as a relative process. The Ottoman Empire remained vast, wealthy, and powerful compared to many contemporaries. Cities thrived, trade continued. Art and architecture persisted. Life for many subjects remained stable. The problem was not immediate collapse, but erosion. Each generation inherited a slightly weaker system than the one before. Solutions were delayed, compromised, or resisted. The gap between the empire and its rivals gradually widened. Reformers recognized the danger. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, voices called for change, military reorganization, administrative reform, fiscal discipline. Some efforts succeeded temporarily, but few addressed underlying structural problems. The empire had been built for expansion. Its institutions assumed growth, new land, and new revenue. When expansion stopped, those institutions struggled to function as designed. Managing stagnation proved more difficult than managing conquest. This period was marked by contradiction. The Ottomans were still feared in some regions and dismissed in others. They could defeat weaker opponents but struggled against organized powers. Their authority remained vast, but increasingly contested. The signs of decline did not announce an ending. They announced a long transition. The empire was entering a phase where survival depended not on inherited strength, but on the ability to reinvent itself. What followed would be a century of experimentation, reform, and crisis, an attempt to reverse erosion without abandoning identity. Whether that attempt would succeed remained uncertain. The slow weakening of Ottoman power did not erase its legacy, but it forced the empire to confront a world that no longer revolved around it. By the early 19th century, this confrontation could no longer be postponed. Military defeats, economic dependency, and diplomatic humiliation made it clear that survival required fundamental change. The question facing the Ottoman leadership was stark: reform the empire from within, or risk gradual disintegration under external pressure and internal decay. The world around the Ottomans had transformed rapidly. European states had undergone industrialization, centralized administration, and military modernization. Nationalism was reshaping identities. International law and diplomacy increasingly favored powerful, industrialized states. The Ottoman Empire, still governed largely by pre-modern institutions, found itself at a dangerous disadvantage. The shock that forced action came not from theory but from defeat. Successive losses to Russia and European coalitions exposed the inadequacy of Ottoman military organization. Armies were poorly trained, command structures outdated, and logistics unreliable. Treaties imposed territorial losses and economic concessions that eroded sovereignty. Reform was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Early attempts focused on the military. New units were trained along European lines. Uniforms, drills, and weaponry were imported. Advisors from France, Prussia, and Britain were invited to reorganize the army. Yet, these efforts repeatedly collided with resistance from entrenched interests, especially the Janissaries. The Janissary Corps, once the backbone of imperial power, had become a barrier to reform. Their privileges, political influence, and resistance to change made modernization impossible. In 1826, the state took a decisive and violent step. The Janissaries were destroyed in a brutal purge known as the Auspicious Incident. Barracks were shelled, leaders executed, and the corps abolished. This act marked a turning point. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman state forcibly dismantled one of its own foundational institutions. It demonstrated both desperation and resolve. With the Janissaries gone, reform accelerated. A new, European-style army was established. Military academies were founded. Conscription expanded. Yet, military reform alone was insufficient. The problems facing the empire were structural. Administration required overhaul. The old system of tax farming, patronage, and local autonomy had produced corruption and inefficiency. Central authority needed to be strengthened, laws standardized, and governance made predictable. This impulse culminated in a sweeping reform movement known as the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. Beginning in 1839, the Tanzimat represented the most ambitious attempt to remake the Ottoman state since its founding. The reform program was articulated through imperial decrees that promised security of life, honor, and property for all subjects. Taxation was to be regulated, conscription was to be standardized. Legal equality, at least in principle, was extended to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. These measures were revolutionary in context. They challenged centuries of social hierarchy and legal distinction. The state sought to redefine loyalty not through religion alone, but through shared citizenship under imperial law. New ministries were established to manage finance, education, justice, and foreign affairs. Bureaucracy expanded dramatically. Officials were trained in modern schools rather than traditional institutions. Record-keeping, statistics, and centralized planning became tools of governance. Western influence was unmistakable. Legal codes were inspired by French models. Military organization borrowed from Prussian examples. Diplomatic practices mirrored European norms. Ottoman elites increasingly spoke European languages, dressed in Western styles, and sent their children abroad for education. Infrastructure development followed. Roads, railways, telegraphs, and ports were constructed to integrate the empire economically and administratively. These projects aimed to stimulate trade, improve communication, and strengthen central control over distant provinces. Education became a battleground of reform. New secular schools taught science, mathematics, and modern subjects, alongside traditional curricula. The goal was to produce administrators, engineers, and officers capable of managing a modern state, yet reform provoked resistance at every level. Religious authorities feared erosion of Islamic law and moral order. Local elites resented loss of autonomy. Ordinary people mistrusted conscription, taxation, and unfamiliar institutions. 4. Many viewed reforms as foreign impositions rather than organic solutions. Non-Muslim communities responded ambivalently. While legal equality offered protection and opportunity, it also brought new obligations including military service and direct taxation. Traditional communal autonomy felt threatened by centralized citizenship. Economic reform proved particularly difficult. Integration into the global economy exposed the empire to competition it could not easily withstand. European manufactured goods flooded Ottoman markets, undermining local industries. Capitulations, trade privileges granted to European powers limited the state's ability to protect its economy. Debt became a growing problem. Infrastructure and military reform required funding the empire lacked. Loans from European banks increased dependency and reduced fiscal independence. Eventually, foreign creditors gained direct control over Ottoman revenues. Despite these challenges, reform continued in waves. Each generation produced new plans, new laws, and new institutions. Some succeeded partially, others failed outright. Progress was uneven and often reversible. Political reform lagged behind administrative change. While councils and advisory bodies were created, real power remained concentrated in the hands of the Sultan and elite officials. Calls for constitutional government grew louder, especially among educated elites influenced by European political thought. These pressures culminated in the promulgation of a constitution in 1876, briefly establishing a parliamentary system. The experiment was short-lived. Within 2 years, the constitution was suspended and autocratic rule restored. This oscillation between reform and repression reflected deep uncertainty. Leaders recognized the need for change but feared loss of control. Every reform risked destabilizing a fragile system already under strain. Nationalism further complicated matters. Ideas of ethnic and national identity spread through the empire, often encouraged by European powers. Balkan populations increasingly demanded independence. Reform intended to integrate subjects, sometimes accelerated fragmentation. The empire found itself trapped. Reform was essential to survival, but reform also weakened traditional structures that had held the state together. Delay meant decline, change meant risk. By the late 19th century, the Ottomans were known as the sick man of Europe, a phrase that captured both reality and prejudice. The empire was weakened, but not dead. It still governed vast territories and millions of people. Its institutions functioned, albeit imperfectly. What distinguished this era was urgency. The margin for error had narrowed. Each decision carried higher stakes. Reform was no longer about improvement, but about preventing collapse. The Tanzimat and subsequent reforms did not fail entirely. They transformed administration, law, education, and military organization. They produced a new elite capable of critical thought and political engagement. They delayed disintegration by decades. But they could not fully overcome structural disadvantages, external pressure, and internal division. Modernization arrived unevenly and too late to restore lost dominance. The empire stood at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. It attempted to become a modern state without abandoning imperial identity, to adopt Western tools without surrendering sovereignty. Whether this balancing act could succeed remained uncertain. The coming years would bring crisis, war, and decisions that would determine whether reform could save the empire or merely postpone its end. The war that finally answered that question began far beyond Ottoman borders. In 1914, Europe descended into a conflict unlike any it had known before. Industrialized warfare, mass mobilization, and global alliances transformed a regional crisis into a world war. For the Ottoman Empire, already weakened and struggling to modernize, the war would prove fatal. At the outbreak of hostilities, the Ottoman leadership faced a dilemma. Neutrality offered temporary safety, but little security. The empire had lost territory repeatedly over the previous decades and feared further encroachment by rival powers, particularly Russia. Survival seemed to require a powerful protector. That protector appeared in the form of Germany. German officers had helped reorganize the Ottoman army, and economic ties had deepened through railways and military contracts. When war erupted, Ottoman leaders calculated that alignment with Germany offered the best chance to recover lost prestige and territory. In late 1914, the empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. This decision transformed a European conflict into a truly global one. Ottoman participation opened fronts across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The empire was unprepared for the scale of modern war. Despite reforms, the army lacked sufficient equipment, transport, and industrial support. Command structures were uneven. Logistics were strained across vast distances, yet Ottoman forces fought with determination, often achieving surprising success. One of the earliest and most significant fronts was the Caucasus. Ottoman leaders hoped to reclaim territory lost to Russia and inspire Muslim populations under Russian rule. The campaign, however, was disastrously planned. Winter conditions, poor coordination, and inadequate supply lines led to catastrophic losses. Entire units were destroyed without ever engaging the enemy. On another front, the empire faced a direct threat to its capital. Allied forces sought to seize control of the Dardanelles, open a supply route to Russia, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. What followed became one of the most famous campaigns of the conflict. At Gallipoli, Ottoman defenders, supported by effective leadership and intimate knowledge of the terrain, repelled repeated Allied landings. The campaign was brutal and costly on both sides. For the Ottomans, it was a rare moment of triumph. The defense of the straits preserved the capital and demonstrated that the empire could still resist the world's strongest powers. Gallipoli also elevated a new generation of officers whose experience and confidence would shape the post-war world. Yet victory could not compensate for failures elsewhere. In the Arab provinces, the war exposed deep internal fractures. British forces advanced through Mesopotamia, seeking to secure oil supplies and strategic routes. Ottoman armies fought fiercely but struggled against superior resources and local opposition. In the Hejaz, rebellion erupted. Encouraged and supported by Britain, Arab leaders rose against Ottoman rule, framing their revolt in nationalist and religious terms. The rebellion undermined imperial authority in regions already distant from central control and strained Ottoman military capacity. The Sinai and Palestine fronts further stretched resources. Fighting against British-led forces intensified, with battles shifting control gradually southward. Supply shortages, disease, and exhaustion weakened Ottoman units long before defeat on the battlefield. Internally, the war accelerated existing crises. The economy collapsed under the weight of mobilization and blockade. Trade routes were disrupted. Inflation soared. Food shortages became severe, particularly in urban centers. Famine struck parts of Anatolia and the Arab provinces, killing hundreds of thousands. Administrative capacity eroded. Officials struggled to maintain order and collect revenue. Corruption worsened. Civilian suffering increased resentment toward the state, especially in regions already alienated by reform policies and centralization. The empire's diverse population, once a source of strength, became a vulnerability in wartime. Mutual suspicion grew. Accusations of disloyalty and collaboration spread. In this atmosphere, one of the darkest episodes in Ottoman history unfolded. In 1915, the government ordered the mass deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia, citing security concerns. What followed was a humanitarian catastrophe. Forced marches, violence, starvation, and disease led to the deaths of vast numbers of civilians. The event left deep scars that continue to shape regional memory and politics. As the war dragged on, Ottoman defeat became increasingly inevitable. Germany's fortunes declined, and Allied pressure intensified. By 1918, Ottoman armies were retreating on all fronts. Communications broke down, morale collapsed. In October 1918, the empire signed an armistice that effectively ended its participation in the war. Allied forces occupied key territories, including Istanbul itself. The state that had ruled for more than 6 centuries now existed in name only. The aftermath was devastating. Victorious powers moved quickly to divide Ottoman lands. Secret agreements and wartime promises shaped new borders with little regard for local realities. Arab provinces were separated under European mandates. Anatolia faced occupation and partition. The Sultan remained on the throne, but authority was hollow. Decisions were dictated by foreign powers. National humiliation deepened public anger and disillusionment. The empire's collapse was not solely the result of defeat in war. World War I exposed structural weaknesses that had accumulated over generations. Modern war demanded industrial capacity, unified national identity, and centralized control on a scale the Ottoman system could not fully achieve. Yet collapse did not mean immediate disappearance. Resistance emerged. New political movements formed. The idea of Ottoman imperial restoration faded, replaced by competing visions of nationhood and sovereignty. World War I marked the end of the Ottoman state as a functioning empire, It shattered remaining illusions of reform within an imperial framework. The balance between tradition and transformation finally broke. What followed would not be an attempt to save the empire, but to replace it. Out of defeat and occupation would emerge a struggle that redefined identity, power, and territory, bringing the long Ottoman story to its final chapter. It ended through a process of dismantling political, territorial, and ideological that unfolded in the years after World War I. What remained of imperial authority collapsed under foreign occupation, internal resistance, and the rise of a new vision that rejected empire altogether. Following the armistice of 1918, Allied forces occupied strategic regions of Anatolia and the imperial capital itself. Istanbul, once the heart of a world empire, was placed under foreign control. Ottoman institutions continued to exist, but sovereignty had evaporated. Decisions were imposed, not negotiated. The Sultanate, already weakened by decades of reform and constraint, became a symbol of submission rather than leadership. The Sultan signed agreements that legitimized occupation and partition. For many, this marked a point of no return. Across Anatolia, resistance began to organize. What started as scattered local defense groups gradually transformed into a coordinated national movement. At its center stood Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, an Ottoman officer whose wartime experience and political clarity allowed him to articulate a new path forward. This movement rejected the premise that the empire could be restored. Instead, it argued that survival required breaking with the imperial past. Sovereignty, it claimed, must rest with the people, not a dynasty. Territory must be defended as a homeland, not as imperial inheritance. The struggle that followed was both military and ideological. Forces loyal to the nationalist movement fought occupying armies and local collaborators. At the same time, new political institutions were established to rival the authority of the Sultan in Istanbul. In 1922, the centuries-old institution of the Sultanate was formally abolished. The last Sultan left the country in exile. With that act, a dynasty that had ruled for over 600 years came to an end. The abolition of the Sultanate was more than a political decision. It marked a fundamental shift in legitimacy. Authority was no longer derived from lineage, religion, or imperial tradition, but from national sovereignty. The Ottoman Empire, as a political entity, ceased to exist. Shortly afterward, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. Its founding principles stood in stark contrast to the empire that preceded it. The new state embraced secularism, nationalism, and republican governance. Imperial identity was replaced by national identity. Institutions were transformed rapidly. The caliphate was abolished. Religious courts were dismantled. Western legal codes replaced Islamic law in state governance. Education was secularized. Language reform reshaped cultural expression. These changes were deliberate and radical. They aimed not to reform the Ottoman system, but to ensure it could never return. The empire's legacy was acknowledged, but its structures were dismantled. For many former imperial subjects, this transformation was disorienting. Generations had lived under Ottoman rule, defined by imperial categories of identity and loyalty. Now those categories were erased. A new political reality demanded new definitions of belonging. Beyond Anatolia, the collapse of the empire reshaped an entire region. Ottoman provinces in the Arab world were divided under European mandates. Borders were drawn by foreign powers, often ignoring historical, ethnic, and tribal realities. States such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan emerged from imperial ruins, their foundations shaped as much by diplomacy as by local aspirations. The Middle East inherited the Ottoman administrative framework but lost its unifying structure. Where one empire had once governed diversity through a single system, multiple states now navigated independence under external influence. Political instability, contested borders, and competing identities followed. In the Balkans, Ottoman withdrawal accelerated national consolidation. States that had once been provinces became nation-states. Ottoman cultural and architectural presence remained, but political authority vanished. The legacy of the empire was complex. For some, it was remembered as a period of relative stability and coexistence. For others, it symbolized domination and stagnation. These memories varied by region, community, and experience. What is clear is that the Ottomans shaped the modern world in lasting ways. Administrative practices, legal traditions, urban landscapes, and cultural exchange across Europe, Asia, and Africa bore their imprint. Even after the empire's fall, its influence endured in institutions, borders, and social structures. The transition from empire to nation-state marked a broader global shift. Multi-ethnic empires across Europe and Asia collapsed or transformed under the pressures of nationalism and modern warfare. The Ottoman case was among the most dramatic, both for its longevity and its reach. The new Turkish state defined itself in opposition to its imperial past, yet it could not escape that past entirely. Language, culture, and collective memory carried Ottoman traces forward. The challenge was not erasure, but reinterpretation. The empire that had once stood at the crossroads of continents ended not with annihilation, but with transformation. Its fall closed a chapter of world history that began in the medieval frontier of Anatolia and extended through centuries of conquest, governance, and adaptation. From a small beylik to a world empire, from imperial zenith to dissolution, the Ottoman story spanned eras and civilizations. Its end marked the triumph of new ideas over old structures, but also the loss of a system that had managed diversity on an imperial scale. The birth of a nation did not negate the empire's legacy, it reframed it. What remained were cities shaped by Ottoman hands, laws influenced by Ottoman precedent, and regions whose histories could not be told without reference to Ottoman rule. The empire was gone, but its shadow stretched across the modern world. The Ottoman Empire ended not because history moved past it, but because history demanded a different form. In that demand lay both its downfall and its enduring significance. This was not merely the end of an empire, it was the conclusion of a civilization's political journey and the beginning of a new chapter whose consequences continue to shape the present.